What is up, everyone? Welcome to our 7th installment of our case study series. I am joined by Angel Melgoza and Kelly Reddy-Heffner. Guys, welcome back. We have a great case study to talk about today. How is everything going? Angel, Kelly, what's going on in your worlds?
Trying to keep up with the heat, trying to stay cool here in Texas. We've hit triple digits, so making sure my AC is still working.
Yes.
How about you, Kelly?
I know. What's up with all the weather and weird things? I am avoiding the outdoors due to smoke infestation and hoping some Canadian wildfires get put out soon. So
Yeah, our very own Paul Boyle sent out some pictures of where he's at in Ohio and some of the smoke that's coming down from the Canadian fires. So definitely has some air quality issues here in Ohio. And Angel, I am with you. I am not in Texas. Our case study today is actually in Texas, but our AC is on the fritz. And right now we are kind of battling with our home warranty people to try to figure that out. So hopefully we get that figured out before the hot temperatures get here to Ohio. But good to have you guys on and looking forward to running through the case study here. So what we're going to do is we're going to kind of go through the case study. And obviously, if you're listening on the podcast, we're going to talk through this as best we can. If you're watching this on YouTube, we'll be able to kind of see the case study as we walk through it. So we're really going through, this is a fictitious couple. They are an engaged couple living in Texas. And Angel will kick us off, and then Kelly will kind of go through some of the goals. I'll go through the balance sheet, and then we'll just kind of look at this case study. What are some of the things that pop out to us and how we would approach this from a planning perspective? So Angel, let me share my screen so the people that are watching can see this. Let me see right here. Share. So without further ado, Angel, why don't you take us away as this pops up here?
Let me kick it off. These are my fellow Texans, right? Even though they're a little fictitious. Yeah. So we have Megan Meyer, who's age 29, is a clinical pharmacist. Matthew Higgins, age 27, he's an IT tech. Pretty typical age of current clients that we have, right? The salaries for Megan, she's earning $150,000 annually. Matthew's earning $100,000 annually with supplemental income, $10,000. I'm guessing that maybe some add-on work that he's taking on.
Right.
Currently, of course, filing single, but they are engaged to be married. See here, residence, Austin, Texas. That's 5 hours north of me. Tell me you're texting, by not telling me you're texting. You measure distance by hours and not by miles, right? So on a combined gross income front, they're both earning combined $260,000. A little bit about their expenses. We try to divvy up fixed, variable, and of course savings as well. From expenses standpoint, their fixed expenses are about $3,250 monthly, $2,000 on variable, and about $1,242 in just savings commitments that they have.
Awesome. Kelly, why don't you go take us through Megan and Matthew's goals?
Sure. So they have reached out to do some financial planning because they've got a couple things on the horizon. There are some student loans, which is not uncommon for our client base. And we know there's been a lot of chatter all summer about student loans. And finally, some of the next steps are starting to unfold. So that's often a prompt to reach out and start a conversation. So they want to have a plan in place for Megan's. She does work for a qualifying 501c3, so PSLF, and a forgiveness strategy is part of the conversation. They are planning to get married, so honeymoon, wedding expenses. So we know one of the inflation items that's still up is travel. So they're planning a very fun honeymoon. It is good to plan ahead for that as far in advance as possible. They are looking to make sure that retirement's on track and feel like they're a little bit behind. Also, again, not an uncommon feeling. So that's one thing we will want to dive into and see what that looks like. Try to come up with a student loan plan that also matches a strategy for some of those other goals like wedding, marriage, and retirement. And then, of course, big things with life in general often include that first home purchase. We know that's been an interesting environment as well. So we'll kind of talk through what the home purchase environment looks like, what the resources are available to expand and be knowledgeable about that big purchase. Children not too far down the road as well. And then, of course, vehicles, open to the conversation about owning and versus leasing, but do identify having a new car need in the next couple years as well.
Yeah, good stuff, Kelly. Thanks for taking us through that. So I'm going to go through kind of the balance sheet, the net worth statement. So I'm going to start on the asset side. So they have about $5,000 in check-in and joint check-in, $20,000 in joint savings. When we look at their investment accounts, they both have 401ks. Megan has about 10,000 in her current 401k. Matthew about 15,000. They're both in target date funds, about 90% in equity. So probably those 20-60 target date funds that are out there. Currently, they're both putting in 5%, but Matthew actually gets a match up to 6%. Megan's is 5%. So that's a plan and opportunity right there. Megan has a little bit of money in her HSA, $2,000. And she's contributing the max to that. And Matthew does have access to an HSA because he's in a high deductible health plan, but he's not yet enrolled. I believe Matthew has a Robinhood account that has about $5,000, and he's putting about $200 a month into that. So, and then Megan is not sure what to do with her old 401k, which has about 5,000. So total assets of about 62,000. On the liability side, so these are the things that we owe. There's a little bit of short-term debt there, about $5,000 on a credit card for Megan, $3,000 on a credit card for Matthew. They try to pay that off monthly. Matthew does have a car note that is $250 per month at an interest rate of 4%. So we've seen those obviously go up recently. So not terrible rate in this environment. And then the big, monstrosity there, I think, are the loans. So she has about $425,000 in loans between her private and her federal loans. So total liabilities of $453,000. So that puts their combined net worth at negative $391,000. So just reiterate, they're doing their own taxes now. So definitely something that we would look at as we're looking at the student loans. And then we do have a section here for like wealth protection. Megan does have group life insurance coverage, so 2 times her salary at $300,000. Matthew has 1.5 times, so 150,000. They both have, kind of the standard short-term and long-term disability policies through their employer. So ONOC for 2 years and then ENEOC after that. And then professional liability, Megan does have her own policy, which is good to see. And then no estate plan at this time. So definitely something to look at. So to kind of reiterate, Megan hates the loans and wants to see them gone, but is open to hear about PS2L. So that would definitely be something that we would want to walk through and show her the math. Matthew, again, doesn't have any loans, student loans. They are looking into stopping funding the taxable account and put those dollars towards debt. And then, as Angel mentioned, Matthew does have some contractor work that he makes on the side. So as we look at this, Kelly, what would you say is the first thing that you would tackle with this particular client as you review the case study here?
Well, I'm going to assume that probably the prompt was the student loans to get that plan in place. So there are a couple little low-hanging fruit items, but they all do work together like pieces of a puzzle to fit. So I guess that would be where I would start to just have an idea of what that monthly payment would be so that we can build the rest of the plan around that.
Yeah, I mean, I think for a lot of our clients, the tail that wags the dog for their financial plan is the student loan. So as the loans go, so does the rest of the plan. So if we're talking about this amount of debt, I think, again, it's not necessarily a push to pay them off, but more of a push to have a plan to pay them off. So I think, one of the things, and I'll skip over to this tab here that kind of outlines the student loans. I think really with this particular client, you have lots of moving pieces here. You're probably going to have a strategy that is related to the federal loans and then a strategy that is related to the private loans. I think the thing that I often say is that the range of outcomes here with regard to the loans can be vast. And if you're looking at our tab here, the total amount paid, and this is kind of just rough numbers given the present student loan plans that are out there, is anywhere from 143,000 to 480,000. So we really want to make sure that as we are approaching the loans, the idea is that we're going through our process. So what we typically do, and what we do for this client, is that we're going to inventory the loans, and we typically do this through the NSLDS ugly text file that we have you retrieve. We're potentially with private loans, look at the credit report. Sometimes we look at promissory notes as well. And then from the inventory, now that we know where we're at, we're going to look at all of the different possibilities related to said loans, right? So we want to put the emotion that Megan has with her loans with the math that supports it. I've joked about this, Kelly and Angel, in the past, that I remember talking to a client that basically is working 20 hours at a for-profit job and 20 hours at a nonprofit job and didn't qualify for PSLF because you essentially need to be 30 hours. And they were like, and they had substantial debt. I don't think it was up to this amount, but they were asking like, what was my advice for the student loans? And I was like, if I can push a broom in a nonprofit for 10 hours a week, I would do that because it just unlocks a lot of the benefit that PSLF affords. So the third part of this really is once we figure out what that strategy is, we want to optimize that. And that's where, looking at the tax situation, looking at the investment strategy and the pre-tax situation, making sure you're filing the taxes correctly. So I would obviously want them to talk to Sean Richards, who's our director of tax, and make sure that the tax situation is jiving, not just with the financial plan, but specifically the student loans. So that's my take. Angel, would you add anything kind of to the student loan picture as you're looking at this? Obviously, it's a huge decision in terms of what they're going to do and will hugely affect the balance sheet as they kind of start, their careers and their lives together.
Absolutely. Just like you said, Kelly said, that figuring out a strategy is key to the plan. What I would do also is really engage in budget. We have to understand our clients' cash flow, because if the goal is to pay off, the loans more sooner rather than later, but the cash flow just isn't there, and we have to see, okay, well, what adjustments do we need to make as planners to our recommendation, PSLF being the strategy, but the repayment plan may be a little bit different than what they may expect.
Yeah, and to that point, the B word, the budget word, never goes away. I mean, even if you are looking at, a retirement picture, we kind of have to know like what we need to build out as a retirement paycheck. That all stems from the budget, right? So I think that is going to be consistent. I think to the sheet, I don't know if we outlined it. I think there was a budget for like 2,000 to 3,000 or 3,000 to 4,000 for Megan to apply towards the loans. And the strategy might be a compromising strategy where we are aggressive with the private loans, try to get them into an aggressive payoff strategy, because obviously we know that those loans are not going to be eligible for PSLF. But then we are doing what we can to maximize the forgiveness on the federal loans. That's kind of where the two-prong approach to the loans really stems from. Kelly, if we stay with the student loans, obviously we're still waiting for the Supreme Court to kind of rule on Biden's effort to forgive some loans. And we think that based on that decision, the president or the government will try to put a plan out there that might be more favorable to borrowers. Can you kind of elaborate a bit on what you've heard or what you've read about that, and how that could potentially affect PSLF and the power of PSLF in the future as we come out of the pause here?
Sure. So, right, Tim, you're referring to that, one-time $10,000 to $20,000 discharge decision. So, for some clients, that's a substantial part of their loans. But
Sure.
for many pharmacists who have accumulated student loan debt, it's not quite as big of a percentage. So the kind of flip side to that you referenced is we're still waiting to hear about like new income-based repayment plan, like new repay that would have a different formula to calculate the monthly payment. The goal with a PSLF program, one is to complete it and be in it for the 10 years, 120 estimated payments, but also to pay the least amount over time, which is
Right.
why, you see that 143,000. I can understand Megan's concern about a 10-year period to have the loans in existence, but referencing Angel as well with the budget, if you have $3,000 and you're putting $1,400 to $2,300 towards the private loans, one, there's only going to be so much left out of that budget, but two, why would you pay extra if you qualify and are doing the work in the nonprofit? But
Yep.
you do need to get the loans in the correct position. Like, so if that new repayment plan comes out and is very advantageous, the formula making that payment lower will create a lower amount total paid over time, which is a win. It does feel like we're continuing across a couple presidential administrations to make PSLF as easy as possible. So sometimes clients still have concerns. Will the program still be in place? Will I qualify? All the answers point towards yes, based on what we know, across a couple different administrations. There have been, programs put in place to make it easier, but you do have to put the loans in the right position. So we've seen these waivers as well, and there's still one more waiver until the end of the year to pick up as many payments as possible. Pretty much the key being that you did work for the nonprofit during the time frame. But if you had odd forbearances, if you were in the wrong repayment plan, if you were in the wrong loan type, but that's some of the work that we do as part of the planning process, is making sure that every loan is in the correct position to qualify and to not have that outcome where you get a surprise. There's no surprises. You're keeping track of your cumulative account. That's what the issue was in the past.
Yeah, and shout out to Tim Albrecht, who recently held a kind of an impromptu webinar about student loans and, what's beyond the pause. I think we had about 600 people register for that webinar. And there were a lot of questions about PSLF, and there's still a lot of misnomers out there about the program. And is it viable? Is it not viable? To your point, Kelly, there has been things that in the past would lead borrowers to question the longevity. I would say that everything that I have read about that has always been for future borrowers, meaning if you're in the program, I think they would grandfather it in. It's just my belief. And I think if you're approaching a strategy of forgiveness, there's a good case, especially if they put out this new payment plan, that your balance is going to grow. So to kind of take that away, retroactively, I think would be catastrophic. And even with tax law, they typically will, write things. And that's why we have so many, versions and layers of tax law. I will point out, as we're showing the slide, if it is a pay as you earn, the numbers that we're showing on the screen is, hey, in 10 years, you're going to pay off $143,000. There's two assumptions here that I think are wrong. One is, if, let's say, Megan's been at work for the last 2 years, or maybe it's the last year, she's already a year in. So we're projecting 10 years as if this is starting right now. So she potentially already has 12 to 24 months that are, counted, or potentially counted if we do the right things. And then I think the other thing is that we're showing a first monthly payment of $1,080, which could also be a lot less given a new repayment plan. So this, again, so many advisors out there still to this day, as I talk to a lot of prospects, will say, hey, I'm working with an advisor, and they say, don't worry about the loans. They'll figure themselves out, which is the worst advice that you can give to many pharmacists that are dealing with 6 figures worth of debt. Or they'll do hey, pay the highest interest rate off or pay the lowest balance. That, quite frankly, is subpar advice. So because the spectrum of outcomes is so wide with regard to what you actually are, paying out of your pocket for the loans, you want to make sure that you get a professional advice on this, because it's that impactful. So guys, let's set the loans aside for a hot second and talk about the other parts of their plan. Angel, obviously with wedding, honeymoon, first home, kiddo in the next 2 years, car in the next 5 years, how does a planner work with a client to kind of wade through all of these things that obviously are huge life events, but obviously from a planning perspective, hugely important to kind of roadmap? Walk me through how you would approach Megan and Matthew in that instance.
Sure. I mean, I think firstly, as we address the student loans, the second thing, looking at their budget, what's left over after we define a good repayment plan for them. And as a planner, we want to make sure that we are being very upfront, real, and having real conversations as to expectations, right? The last thing we would want is to take out more debt when we don't need to.
That's right.
And just going through what their expenditures are, what's left over, and coming up with a comfortable budget for all of these things. You really can't plan a budget for an additional family member, but at least, drafting up what does that look like, on a nationwide kind of average scale. Typically, when I'm working with younger individuals, I like to throw in an extra $2-3 grand a month for raising a child. That is very subjective, but that's very much kind of my flat conservative rule of thumb.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I'm a big believer in, if I'm breaking this down with a client, and Kelly, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this too. I'm a big believer in saying, okay, wedding, honeymoon, like how much is that? Is that paid for? What are the sources of income, or what are the sources of savings for that? First home. Okay. Is it within the next year, next 2 years? So look, like what are we looking at for a down payment? Obviously, I'd want to put them in front of someone like Nate Hedrick to help with like an agent and finding an agent, or even Tony Umholtz to look at, First Horizon and potentially a Farm D loan, and make sure that, that is positioned. And then, first child in the next 2 years, what does that look like from a daycare expense, or just, hospital bills? Where are we funding that? And then car, if that's a 5 year. So kind of backwards plan into this. And, we talk about purpose-based investing, kind of by proxy. I'm a big fan of like purpose-based savings. So I would love to see a bucket for house. I would love to see a bucket for car. I would love to see a bucket for kiddos. Like I was joking around with someone. We have an Ally account that is the kids account, and the sub accounts are Olivia, my daughter, Liam, my son, and Benji, our dog. So Benji, for his grooming and vet bills and things like that. Olivia for swim and other things like that. So it allows Shay and I to kind of break these expenses down. When we throw all these things against the wall, Kelly, it's overwhelming, right? It's just a lot of things, one right after the other. So walk me through kind of like how you would approach that, how you would select buckets, how you would determine like, okay, overlaying the student loans. And maybe that's where the student loans were like, well, maybe we need a little bit of extra discretionary income and go out, not 5 years in the private loan, but maybe 10 years to free up some income for us, to do some things. So walk me through that in terms of the savings perspective.
Right. Because once we have like one set of numbers with the student loan,
Yeah.
you want to build out, as you said, Tim, those buckets, but you need to run some estimates. So typically, I probably would start with the house, but clients, do need to be candid about their goals. And one of our objectives is to help clients do what they want to do within those realistic, like giving pros and cons. And well, that might take a little bit longer if you want to do it at that amount. So, certainly it would be up to them what the priorities are in terms of wedding, house, preparing for a child, in that new car, but giving some context to those decisions. So like if the new house is in a year, you'd be looking at, some estimates. If you bought a $250,000 home versus a $450,000 right now in the current environment, it's super fun to do the two interest rates, like this crazy rate, but are people still able to buy homes? Yes, but you need to know what that's going to look like in terms of a mortgage payment. But then I also like to run the numbers at like, a 4%. So in case the environment changes in the next year, it makes a big difference in the monthly payment. Are you doing a 3% down, a Farm D loan? Are you doing 20% down, something in between? So kind of run a couple of those numbers so you can see a range. If this is what you want to do on the lower end or on the upper end, this is the amount per month in a year time frame to do it and to get to the down payment. Definitely childcare, one of the biggest parts of, a child expense. So making sure that we have a good holding place in the budget for that. Looping back to the house, it seems obvious, but doing that amount for a year and knowing you can do it for a mortgage amount makes a lot of sense. Like if your rent's $1,000, you want to buy a house and the mortgage is $2,500. Typically that $1,500 difference, can you consistently put that away for a year one, for the down payment, but two, that's becoming your new average monthly expense. So like, if you can do it for a year, that feels pretty good that you're going to be able to sustain it and continue it. So yeah, putting some context, some hard numbers, knowing they're not going to be to the penny, but this gets you, well, I say we can calculate to the penny, but there's going to be lots of things that happen in between, anything, a job change, a new dog, all the things, that help influence that monthly budget. We need to, have a placeholder for.
That's right. And I think one of the things that we haven't really discussed that I think is important to discuss, typically when we talk about, a budget, we're always looking at where can we potentially cut expenses and things like that. The thing I would really dig in with Matthew in particular is, hey, you have supplemental income of $10,000. Is there a way for us to grow the top line income that's coming in? So, can we push that $10,000 to $25,000 next year? Megan, if we do have pretty, hairy, audacious goals, are there ways for you to also make additional dollars, by picking up extra shifts or whatever? So I think sometimes we always look at the expense side of the ledger, and I want to grow the pie and make sure that, that's looking, healthy, and we have other levers that we can potentially pull. Angel, let's shift to the wealth building stuff real quick. They're kind of just starting out. There's one old 401k. They're in some target date funds in their current 401k. We don't have any IRAs established, which I don't know if I would necessarily do that now. Matthew has a taxable account of $5,000, which again, I would try to apply, like when we're asking questions about, hey, how are we going to fund the home down payment, or the car? Like that's where I want to start drawing those lines. But how would you approach the wealth building portion of their financial plan with kind of the facts that we have?
With some of the facts that we have, wealth building, and what I'd like to look at first is, do you have an established emergency fund? Because we all know that, things do happen, stuff.
Yeah.
I want to make sure that our clients are prepared for that. More on the, are you on track with savings, things of that nature? I would definitely start off by looking at the 401ks, making sure they're at least maxing out the amount that they would receive an employer match. From looking here, I believe Matthew's deferring 5%, but the match is 6%. Maybe trying to get him up to that 6% is the next step for him. On the HSA fronts, it looks like they don't put any money into an HSA. I think that's a very good tool for young, healthy couples, right? That you traditionally just have your physicals, your checkups, and maybe a couple of doctor visits because of a cold, a flu, what have you, and making sure that those are maxed out. You end up saving, on the payroll tax front, you end up saving on the federal income tax front. And to the point of going back to the student loans, Megan can also reduce her adjusted gross income, and that'll even save her on the back end. But yeah, to your point on the taxable account, seeing what's that account for, right? You have a lot of goals that you want to achieve, and maybe putting some purpose behind it. We have it here as listed as a play account. But to me, on a scale, if we have a pyramid of what's important, play accounts would be at the tip. That's the cherry on top for me, right? I would definitely want to address the fundamental things like, again, your emergency fund. Are you putting into your 401ks, and are your current savings, do they have a purpose?
Yeah, that's right. And I think, to circle back, I think Megan is contributing the max to HSA, even though it's not showing, it's just showing in text there. So, and she has about $2,000. I'm assuming that's in cash and not invested. I think the discussion I would have about that is, are we planning on using this for the birth of a child? Or do we see this as like a long kind of that stealth IRA? And maybe we're going to use it for the birth of a child and then afterwards build it back up and then it'll be a stealth IRA or something that effect. Sometimes good to be able to, cash flow health expenses when you get to that point. So for the current 401ks, I think, looking to make sure that those target date funds, Kelly, look good. Oftentimes we like to get out of the target date funds because they're a little bit more expensive and basically pick the allocation ourselves. And then probably the last thing that we haven't really talked to is just, what do we do with the 401k, the old 401k? Do we roll that over to a rollover IRA for YFP to manage on behalf of Megan, or do we move that over to our current 401k to be able to assess that? Let's chat, Kelly, really quickly about the wealth protection stuff. Mm-hmm. My initial gut on this is they're probably okay at this point in time, and I would want them to focus on the debt and wealth building, but probably phase 2, phase 3 might be looking more closely at the wealth protection stuff. What's your thought on that? Do you kind of differ in your opinion, or would you say, hey, let's kind of get through some of these other things that are on fire and then kind of pivot to life, disability, the estate plan, et cetera?
Right. I mean, certainly the wealth protection piece, as much as some of the other things feel overwhelming and
Yeah.
voluminous to tackle, this actually is probably the area where our clients struggle the most, just to see like how much to prioritize and what they really want to have and to figure that out. So, right, I would agree, layers of life typically influence how much protection is needed and how comfortable you feel with what you have. I do like that Megan has enough coverage to cover her private student loans. That's an area that's a bit gray depending on the loan
Right.
servicer. So she's got that covered. So really we try to look at liability need, like if there's something that needs paid off, that would be a big one. From there, we do that as part of our planning, to do a very thorough assessment, see what they have. But I would agree, the estate planning, we can do some conversation and work on that during the protection meeting, like checking your beneficiaries, making sure the titling is correct on accounts. That's one layer ahead of getting a will and formal documents in place. So yeah, I would say that's something that we work on, as we move through the financial plan. It is important, but the amounts of coverage, do look fairly reasonable. I probably would address at some point the own occupation for 2 years on those disability policies. Our gold standard is typically to recommend own policies for clients in that area. But again, they do have coverage. That would just be a note, that I would check into further.
Yeah, I think in this regard, what I'm doing as I'm going through the wealth protection part of the financial plan is I'm looking at what the baseline coverage is and I'm planting seeds. I'm saying, hey, it probably makes sense in the future to look at your own life insurance policy. It probably makes sense in the future to look at your own disability policy. It probably makes sense in the future to have an estate plan that's drawn up by an attorney. And I think these are typically most important. I say this a lot: when you have a spouse, a house, and mouths to feed. And we know that Megan and Matthew are kind of trending in that direction. I think anybody needs an estate plan if they're a human and they want to kind of, their care and be able to pay their bills if they're unable to. But I think the ante is upped, when you have other people that are kind of relying on you for their livelihood, and we want to make sure that we take care of the family. So in my mind, I'm kind of planting those seeds that say, hey, this is important now. It's going to be more important in the future. So let's take steps when we kind of get the dust cleared and settled on the student loans and the investments and things like that, the budget, to make moves, here in the future. So great stuff, guys. Really appreciate the conversation. I feel like we could go on and on about this particular client. So thank you for, kind of going through this with me in the 7th edition of the case study series. If you're out there listening to this and you're thinking, hey, this sounds, vaguely familiar to my situation, don't be shy. Reach out to us, book a discovery meeting, and let us know if we would potentially be a good fit to work together. So Angel and Kelly, thank you once again, and looking forward to doing this next time.
Thank you for having us.
As we conclude this week's podcast, an important reminder that the content on this show is provided to you for informational purposes only and is not intended to provide and should not be relied on for investment or any other advice. Information in the podcast and corresponding materials should not be construed as a solicitation or offer to buy or sell any investment or related financial products. We urge listeners to consult with a financial advisor with respect to any investment. Furthermore, the information contained in our archived newsletters, blog posts, and podcasts is not updated and may not be accurate at the time you listen to it on the podcast. Opinions and analyses expressed herein are solely those of your financial pharmacist unless otherwise noted, and constitute judgments as of the dates published. Such information may contain forward-looking statements which are not intended to be guarantees of future events. Actual results could differ materially from those anticipated in the forward-looking statements. For more information, please visit yourfinancialpharmacist.com. www.yourfinancialpharmacist.com/disclaimer. Thank you again for your support of the Your Financial Pharmacist podcast. Have a great rest of your week.